new drinks are now at McDonald's. With refreshers like the Strawberry Watermelon Refresher and the Mango Pineapple Refresher with popping boba. To crafted sodas like the Sprite Berry Blast with berry flavors and cold foam. Who knew ice-cold drinks could be so fire? Try them all now at McDonald's.
Refreshers contain caffeine. Copyright 2026, The Coca-Cola Company. Sprite is a registered trademark of The Coca-Cola Company.
Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptations. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. This week, I'm excited to be doing another Heated Rivalry Q&A with some great questions that were sent in from listeners. A few of them I have been excited to get back into conversation about because at the height of the show coming out, I had made review videos for every scene in the series, and these questions were some of the ones I got asked the most when the show came out and I was posting these reviews. So I'm just going to jump right into it, and forewarning, I will be discussing The Long Game briefly in a couple of these answers. So if you are someone who hasn't read the book, doesn't want to know any of the spoilers, you've just been warned. There is some light discussion about The Long Game, particularly in the last question of this Q&A. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this first question I got was, when David returns home after seeing the boys, what does he say to Yuna? I find this part so confusing. On one hand, I can see how she may not know, but on the other, I find it very hard to believe that her husband of 26 plus years came home in a state and she wouldn't demand to know what was wrong. They were just sitting on the couch in silence until the boys came over. That doesn't make sense to me. And it has to have been at least 15 or 20 minutes before they show up and David had returned home. Thoughts? So I personally, when watching, felt like he said nothing to Yuna for a very good reason, but let's break this down to give the scene some proper context and make sense of the choice to write and shoot the scene like this. So in the book, Shane enters into his parents' house. They immediately stand from where they were both sitting on the couch, and internally, Shane notes that it was clear that his father had told his mother what he had seen. In the show, though, I read that David did not tell Yuna about what he had seen before Shane arrived, and that was confirmed by Christina Chang, who plays Yuna, in an interview that she gave with TV Guide back in January, where she said that the idea was that it was a genuine surprise to Yuna, and the way we chose to do it was that he didn't say anything. David came home, and we just sat on the couch, and we were watching whatever. I think he was going to eventually say what he saw, and to stop the bleeding, the boys showed up relatively quickly a few minutes later. So we played that moment as genuinely in the dark for Yuna. So in the show, when we are put inside the house with David and Yuna, we watch Shane and Ilya approaching the front steps together through the window. And Shane is walking ahead while Ilya follows slightly behind him. He glances back behind him once to make sure Ilya is still there. And the brilliance of shooting this through the window is that since we are inside the house, we can hear David say, and Yuna starts to say what, and looks visibly confused when she looks over at David, and he keeps his head down. So before she stands up and turns towards the door, we can tell that there's confusion going on between Yuna and David. I had also pointed out in my original breakdown of this scene how smart the set decoration is, because we can see Shane's trophies, his jersey, and photos of him all over their walls, and their house is entirely filled with evidence of how proud they are of Shane, and yet Shane still believed that they might never speak to him again if they learn the truth about him. And that emotional contradiction is really relevant ahead of this scene and the scenes that follow it. When Shane enters and says, "Hey, it's me, Shane, hi," the acting and the camera blocking continues to emphasize that David has not told Yuna anything. Because as David starts to explain that he left his charger at Shane's place and it's the only one that fits into his phone, Yuna looks back at David again very clearly confused. Then she turns nervously towards Shane before her eyes pan slowly over to Ilya, and she looks at him as though he's a predator that's entered into her house, which mirrors the book description of Shane observing his parents, looking at Ilya like he was a mountain lion that was about to attack. The shot of Ilya and Shane in the entry, which is shot over the shoulders of Yuna and David, is one of my favorite moments of camera blocking because it centers the two of them between Yuna and David, which provides so much narrative information without them having to say anything, because visually positioning them at the center is also symbolic of this emotional shift that's about to happen within their family dynamic in the scenes that follow this one. So Shane has always been the center of their world, and we've seen him centered between David and Yuna in this similar blocking where the camera is behind their backs multiple times throughout the series. And now we're seeing Shane and Ilya positioned this way, which subtly communicates to us as viewers that this relationship is about to become the center of Shane's parents' world too. Yes, this scene is about Shane telling his parents that he is gay, but on a larger scale, it's about Shane asking his parents to understand and protect the person and relationship that he has guarded so closely and make space in their family for the person that he loves. By positioning them this way, where they're standing so close and facing Shane's parents with very visible fear of rejection or disappointment on their faces, we're observing them the way that Shane is asking Yuna and David to see them, which is together as a unit. And that is so symbolic as well for someone like Ilya, who has never felt a part of his own family and has spent so long feeling like he may never get to experience that for himself. Shane says, "It's okay, Dad. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have found out that way." And Ilya's eyes are moving back and forth between Yuna and David because, again, he has almost no experience with healthy family dynamics. The only family model he knows is his own. And he was always met with ridicule, shame, or insults by his own father. So he's genuinely nervous about how this interaction is going to go because this is also unfamiliar territory for him too. As Shane and David attempt to clarify the situation between them, Yuna looks between the two of them again before she finally asks, "Found out what exactly?" And again, both her body language and the inflection and intonation of her voice suggests that she was not given the whole story by David when he got home. And I think the reason Jacob chose to make this change from the book says a lot about who David is in the show and his characterization, because David deeply respects Shane's privacy. So I imagine that after walking in on Shane and Ilya, David came home, made up an excuse as to why he came home so quickly, sat down on the couch, business as usual, and that would be because he would understand that Shane has kept this hidden for a reason. He would understand that it's because Shane was not ready to tell them yet. So who is David to then take that choice away from his son by telling Yuna for him? So instead, he gives Shane the opportunity to tell them himself in his own way and reveal as much or as little as he feels comfortable sharing with them. And I can only reach this conclusion because of the groundwork Jacob laid throughout the season with David's character. So across the show, David is quietly focused on Shane. He observes him from across rooms or tables. And even when Yuna is speaking, he is focused on Shane's reactions instead of what Yuna is saying. So he's constantly trying to gauge Shane's emotions and encourage him to be a human being outside of his hockey persona. And we see him spending time talking with Shane more casually at the cottage, engaging with Shane's interests in YouTube rabbit holes while Yuna is pushing him towards hockey videos. And he also reframes the Wimbledon trip as a family vacation rather than a business obligation. And in all of these small little scenes and moments, David is positioned as this very steadfast support system for Shane. That's also why I love the decision to make David less hockey obsessed than Yuna, because it completely flips the stereotype of the overbearing hockey dad on its head. And David clearly does not love Shane more or less because he's good at hockey. He loves him regardless of the hockey. and the show repeatedly positions him as a place Shane can retreat to when the pressure of hockey becomes overwhelming for him, because David decenters hockey in favor of Shane's well-being. So when Shane says, "I'm gay," which I was going to tell you soon, Yuna's reaction is that of immediate surprise. But David looks at him with a face full of guilt because, again, David understands that if he had not walked in on them, Shane likely would have waited longer to come out to them. He had not been ready yet. And from David's perspective, this intrusion into Shane's private life has now caused Shane so much distress. And that guilt would likely heighten when Shane, the person who's actually been cornered in this situation, apologizes to them instead and says, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I did not want this to be how I told you. I'm sorry." So when David shakes his head afterwards, I felt like that was his way of apologizing to reiterate the fact that he feels bad about how this all has come to light and that he feels guilt that his accidental discovery of Shane and Ilya became the catalyst for Shane having to reveal this secret that he has clearly gone great lengths to keep from his parents. Then later at the dinner table, when Shane tells them that their relationship has existed since the summer before their rookie season, that feeling likely becomes heavier for David because he would have realized just how long Shane has been carrying this alone. When Shane chooses Ilya here so openly in front of his parents and he's being so brave, it really would mean the world to Ilya. And in the book, we are able to get Ilya's internal narration of how monumental this day is to him. But with these few small scenes, we're able to watch Ilya go from scared and vulnerable and nervous to relaxed and comfortable by the end of their dinner. And we know that in large part, that would be because of the time in between the scenes when Shane is with Yuna and Ilya is left with David, which again is such a masterful way that Jacob is able to externalize Ilya's feelings without having to rely on his internal dialogue. But these sequences also communicate David's feelings too, because as the evening goes on and David observes Shane and Ilya together and sees the safety that they feel in one another, and how much this relationship means to Shane and how much he values it and how clearly Ilya loves him, that brings David so much peace to know that Shane has found something real and loving and worth protecting. And he and Yuna are able to come to that conclusion together, which sets up their dynamic with Ilya and Shane beautifully ahead of the storyline that we'll see pulled from The Long Game in season 2. This question is, "Hey, I love your podcast and listen to every Heated Rivalry episode. I've always been curious how Shane would have ended his sentence, and I guess I thought, on the Vegas rooftop scene. Do you think he meant they'd hook up again at the event?" So I had a short discussion with the person who asked me this question on Instagram, and I had told her that I had waffled back and forth on this one for a while because I could have seen it going a few different ways, but Hudson played it so well that my interpretation of the scene is very much heightened by his choices and also informed by the book. So in the book, Shane is hyper aware of Ilya not being downstairs the whole time that he's at this award show. And he's focused on trying to find Ilya. And he's very torn internally about wanting him so badly. The show does touch on that with the shot of him at the bar, glancing around the room. And then in the show only change of having Scott Hunter there, they use him to point blank ask Shane, "Where's your boy Rosenau?" when he's inviting Shane to take shots with the rest of the rookies. So again, where so much of Shane's curiosity for where Ilya is and his desire to see him and the want he feels that night, all of that's so internal in the book. The show needed a way to externalize that, and they also needed to make Scott more of a fixture early on, so it made sense that they inserted this scene here for both of those reasons. Given that the book makes it clear that Shane wants Ilya that night and he's thinking about hooking up with him again and spends the whole time searching for him, I do think part of him would have believed that they would be meeting up later on that night, but he realizes once Ilya sours on him on the roof that that's likely not going to happen that night. So perhaps in one scenario, Shane would end that sentence with some iteration of, "And I guess I thought we would be hooking up later," or something of that nature. But my initial interpretation of the scene was that he wanted to say something along the lines of, I thought we could talk to one another or talk candidly with one another. But Ilya being combative in that moment leads Shane to believe that that's not the case, or at the very least that Ilya does not want to talk to him like that outside of their hookups. And to me, it's such a classic case of their attachment styles getting in the way of their communication, because Shane constantly hears what Ilya is saying to him, runs it through a very self-deprecating filter, and then wholeheartedly believes that Ilya is being mean or making fun of him on purpose, at least in these early years of their relationship. And Ilya's words press on a lot of his internal wounds. And in this specific scene, he thinks Ilya is bitter about the fact that Shane won Rookie of the Year, and that for once, Shane bested him in something. Because all throughout the first few years that Shane and Ilya know one another, they're competing internationally against one another twice. They're propped up as two of the best players in the world and are made into rivals by the media going into their first year in the NHL. So Shane is always comparing himself to Ilya internally at the beginning of their relationship. He's comparing how he looks like a boy next to Ilya and how Ilya is more manly, how Ilya in the book is taller than him. He's comparing how Ilya is more experienced than him in the bedroom and how things tend to just come easily for him. He's jealous that Ilya doesn't need to be as squeaky clean as he does, and how Ilya can smoke and still beat him on the treadmill, or in the show, it's a stationary bike. So Shane is so hyper aware of his own shortcomings that he is incapable of empathizing with Ilya or even imagining that Ilya might have some battles he's fighting internally. And this scene is the externalization of that, which I think is very appropriate given their ages at this moment. And Shane, at this point in his character arc, cannot conceptualize that for someone else, going home could be a negative thing, because it has never been a negative thing for him. And for the viewer who has had a peek behind the curtain and been inserted into scenes where Shane is not present and observed Ilya with his family, we can ascertain that it is a very negative thing for him to be going home. But Ilya does not communicate that to anyone, and especially not to Shane in this moment. Instead, he puts up a wall and then gets upset when Shane doesn't respond to this teeny tiny itty bitty piece of personal information that he offers up to him correctly. Ilya says, I'm going home in 3 days, and that could mean anything to Shane. And Ilya offers that up to Shane as his explanation as to why he was up on the roof all night, which is a huge deal for Ilya because vulnerability would feel extremely dangerous for his nervous system. So when Shane replies with, okay, must be nice, it's a response that presses on a bruise and ends up being a landmine that Shane accidentally steps on. But he couldn't have known that because Ilya never shares anything personal about himself. And Shane previously doesn't ask Ilya a lot about his personal life because he knows that more than likely he'll be met with a non-answer. And Shane's afraid of letting their dynamic get too personal too. So he doesn't bother to ask. And in the book, in this scene, Shane has the thought that he wasn't sure if Rozanov had more to tell him or not. He decided not to push. It wasn't like they were friends. And that leads to a stalemate where Ilya stays silent and looks at him, and he's very visibly hurt and frustrated. And then he turns away and refuses to make eye contact. And you can see that Shane knows he did something wrong, but he doesn't know what he did. And Ilya is normally the one between the two of them who takes the initiative. So that's when Shane delivers this open-ended line. And I guess I thought maybe and realizes that Ilya has completely shut down. So he ends the sentence with, never mind, okay, I'm gonna, and he backs away. And Shane aborts the conversation altogether to protect himself from being hurt. And we see him walking away, and Hudson does a tremendous job showing how wounded Shane is by Ilya shutting down. And to me, that is the moment where we can see how this transcends a missed opportunity for a hookup, and it ventures into something deeper for Shane, which is why I think that sentence would probably have ended with some iteration of, I guess I thought we were closer, I guess I thought we were friends now and we could talk about things, or that on this night at the end of our rookie season where it was down to the wire between the two of us, I guess I thought I could talk to the one person who understands what this feels like. And I always harken back to the quote at the beginning of the book where Shane and Ilya shake hands at the international tournament. And when Shane locks eyes with Ilya and squeezes his hand, Ilya thinks to himself, I know we were supposed to stand alone at the top, but we will always be there together. We will keep climbing until no one else can reach us, but it will always be together. And this scene, in a way, is sort of a 2.0 of that. So it's a perfect example of the two of them being stuck in their patterns and in their own heads and operating within their own protective strategies. And those strategies would have been formed in their childhoods as emotional regulation and interrelational strategies with people that would help to keep their nervous systems feeling safe. And so for Shane, we see him tell Ilya, fuck off, or he gets defensive whenever Ilya gets too close to a touch point. Even though every time Ilya does get closer to knowing Shane, I think he really actually likes it. But Ilya's very existence forces Shane to confront parts of himself that he has been resisting. So by definition, he feels like a threat to Shane's nervous system. For Ilya, his humor is a way to deflect the conversation or focus off of himself. So if he's injecting humor into every interaction he has with people, it's a way for him to keep the conversation from getting too heavy, or worse, for people getting too close to him emotionally. But we know that every time Ilya calls Shane boring, it's an admission of love. So it doesn't work all that well for him from the viewer standpoint, because we very quickly catch on to the double meanings behind his words. And in this earlier part of Shane and Ilya's relationship, Ilya mainly uses his humor to maintain distance while staying connected to Shane, because it's an easier way for him to avoid vulnerability by teasing him so that he doesn't have to express how he feels directly. Because again, Ilya is often using his humor as a way to protect himself. So that means that quite often everything he says has a double meaning, and that double meaning allows him to backtrack at any point when things were to get too serious. So he can always just say he was just joking if he ever felt like things were getting too scary or real. And an example of that is the tuna melt scene when he first asks Shane to stay when they're in bed together, and he can sense Shane getting nervous that this may feel too intense. So Ilya backtracks with humor and says, I'm not done with you yet, to disguise the fact that he's asking Shane to stay because he's very serious about that and it means a lot to him. We also see in the tuna melt scene where Ilya is trying to figure out if Shane likes women, that he can use his humor to test the waters in certain situations. So how he says, I like girls, but I also like you. And then he uses humor to cover up how serious a statement that is by saying, not as a person, of course, but you have a good mouth. We also see this same protective behavior whenever Ilya is being sarcastic. So in Tampa, when he was deeply hurt by Shane leaving at the end of the tuna melt scene, he uses sarcasm to minimize his own hurt feelings. So when he says to Shane, what, that you ran away? Or when he says, is simple for me, that's his brain protecting itself from the very real pain of his own emotions. And these patterns that Ilya has in the show and in the book, they would have been created when he was a kid. And it would only take one time when he was emotional and made to feel unsafe or made to feel humiliated or ashamed for it, that this pattern would develop. And based on what we know about Ilya's childhood trauma, this has always fit for me. And for someone like Ilya, who is typically joking as a way to protect himself, for him to withdraw in the way we see him withdraw in this scene is indicative of a total shutdown surrounding this topic of home and going home. And of course, Ilya is a fictional character. I'll never know the true nature of how he ticks because I did not write him. But normally he uses humor to maintain a connection with people and maintain his connection with Shane, because it, again, allows him to control how vulnerable things get between the two of them. So to see a conversation get to the point where Ilya can't even self-regulate by way of humor and immediately enters into this withdrawal, that's when it would mean that his nervous system has shifted. So instead of trying to defend his brain from pain, it's moved into a full shutdown to protect himself from further pain because he's already in pain. When Shane then turns around before he leaves and extends his hand and says, "I guess I'll see you next season," it snaps Ilya out of that withdrawal because he realizes that he'll be leaving in 3 days to return home to his father and to Russia and all the things he's been trying to avoid. That's all imminent. And just like he does in the Vegas bathroom scene in episode 2, I think he takes the opportunity to kiss Shane and give himself something to hold on to for the summer because he doesn't know how to talk to Shane and tell him how he feels, but he knows how to kiss him and try his best to convey it. And the desperation in this kiss quite literally stuns Shane. It's, to me, the personification of everything that neither of them will say out loud because Shane kisses him back angrily once he gets over the initial shock because he was upset all night that Ilya had been hiding up on the roof and was unwilling to go down and face Shane and congratulate him and shake his hand because he won. And in the book, Shane says Ilya made him feel bad for winning because, again, that's how Shane is internalizing Ilya's actions in this moment. For Ilya, this kiss is total desperation and trying to get them back to that safe zone that they've established between them, which is always when they're being physical with one another and when things feel a little bit risky. And you can see Ilya once again trying to bring the humor back into the interaction in order to protect himself from the bad feelings he's experiencing while thinking about going home, because he smirks at Shane once he says he's worried about getting caught. And Ilya likes when Shane is angry, so he's trying to fall back into that established pattern between the two of them. But Shane shuts it down and leaves him there. And Ilya uses his sarcasm again as a defense mechanism by saying, "See you next season," in that sort of playful, suggestive way. But when that doesn't work, he tries a last-ditch Hollander to see if he will come back, but Shane doesn't. And that's when all too quickly we watch that mask that Ilya had put on slip right back off and reveal Ilya's true pain and hurt and confusion about what's happening inside of him when it comes to his feelings for Shane. And on top of that, all of the feelings he's already been having all night about his return to Russia for the summer. This question is, does Svetlana know it's Shane specifically, or just that Ilya is in love with a man? So yes, I absolutely believe Svetlana knows that Jane is Shane. And to me, this is another example of how intelligently the show handles exposition. Svetlana is first introduced to Jane in episode 1 when Jane cancels on Ilya the night of his game against Montreal. And Svetlana happens to read the text message on Ilya's phone. And at that time, there's no reason for her to question it, but the show plants that information early so that it can later become context that Svetlana can start to pull from as she starts to put the pieces together. In episode 2, we learn that Svetlana already knows Ilya is bisexual through the scene in Russia with Sasha. After Ilya loses in the Olympics, she brings him to Sasha in that bathroom, thinking that maybe it would cheer Ilya up because she clearly knows that the two of them have a history together. So this is when we start to understand as viewers that Svetlana understands Ilya's personal life, she's in tune to his emotions, and she is obviously not oblivious of this part of Ilya, nor does she feel any jealousy over him sexually. In episode 4, Svetlana brings up Jane again in the back of the car on their way to the club when she asks whether Ilya has been seeing anyone seriously, and then specifically mentioning Jane because they have been texting for years. And Ilya's reaction to her here is what stands out because he immediately deflects, and we see him use the same nervous tell, touching his nose, that the show repeatedly associates with him lying or hiding something, which is a behavior that Svetlana has clearly observed in him before. And notably, we just saw him react the same way when Svetlana brings up Shane Hollander on TV, because in the scene directly before the car, she catches Ilya alone in the dark watching Shane's documentary and comments that Shane is attractive, and again, Ilya deflects. Then in episode 5, during their conversation about the All-Star game, Svetlana pushes him again. She brings up Shane, how they're on the same team this year, and then starts laying on how talented he is, how attractive he is, and she watches Ilya awkwardly deny something that should be objectively obvious because, again, Svetlana already knows that Ilya is bisexual. So his overcompensation reads differently to her than it would to anyone else. And she can tell he is avoiding the conversation about Shane. When she doubles down by bringing up how badly she wants Ilya to play on a line with him and how he can play wing on Shane's line, there's an intentional double meaning there. Ilya can play both positions, meaning center or wing, while Shane strictly plays center. Ilya is bisexual and Shane is gay. And I don't necessarily think Svetlana herself consciously means this in that way, but Jacob absolutely could have structured the dialogue to carry that subtext for the audience here. When Svetlana brings up Rose Landry, it's another indicator that she is closely following Shane's personal life, just as closely as his hockey career. Just as Ilya has been obsessing over articles and comments about Shane and Rose, it would be reasonable for us to assume that Svetlana has also seen comments and read articles. And when she makes a comment about Rose's style and her possible appearance at the All-Star weekend, that's another opportunity for her to monitor Ilya's reaction. But more importantly, it shows us that she's probably noticed a correlation between Shane and Rose becoming public and Ilya's shifts in his behavior. And she points out at the top of their conversation that he has also started smoking again. So once again, we watch him lie to her, but we're also being told by her pointing that out that she's noticed that shift in his behavior as well. So by the time we reach their conversation at Ilya's father's funeral in episode 5, I think Svetlana has absolutely figured it out. When she tells Ilya that she loves him, but knows that he does not love her in the way that he loves Jane, and then deliberately uses the word he when she says she hopes Jane knows how lucky he is, the implication feels very intentional. Svetlana is very smart and clearly observant, and arguably she knows Ilya best. So she's been spending years watching him closely. She knows all his tells, and she has picked up on the fact that Shane specifically affects him in a way that differs from everyone else in his life. And the scene between them in episode 5 reinforces that because Ilya instinctively opens his mouth to object to her comments right after she compares herself to Jane, and Svetlana gives him a knowing look and does not allow him to lie to her again. The expression on Ilya's face immediately afterwards says so much because that's when he realizes that she knows. And what I love most about this reveal is that it changes so much for Ilya emotionally in that moment, because in a way, Svetlana's acknowledgement gives him the permission he was not willing to give himself to stop denying the truth of his feelings. And that's why after the funeral, he calls Shane in this moment instead of turning to Svetlana. And having Svetlana as the implied catalyst for Ilya to pick up the phone and call Shane in that moment was one of my favorite adaptation choices. In the books, Svetlana does not find out that Ilya is with Shane until the long game, when Ottawa is playing in Boston and he gets dinner with Svetlana. They have a very long conversation at dinner about Shane and Ilya's relationship with Shane, but I suspect the show will approach this dinner conversation very differently. Their conversation will likely focus on Ilya's worsening depression and how he is isolating his emotions from Shane. And honestly, I think that giving Ilya one person who already knows about Shane and having them in his corner before he leaves Boston for Ottawa is a nice change, because Svetlana is someone who can understand why he is making that choice to leave and also understand the implications within the hockey world and support him through that decision. What I really hope season 2 explores, though, is Svetlana interacting directly with Shane, because by moving up the timeline and having her discover the truth earlier than she does in the books, the show creates an opportunity for a new dynamic between Shane and Svetlana that didn't exist in the source material. Svetlana isn't just Ilya's closest friend. In many ways, she's the closest thing he has to family, especially now that he's no longer speaking with his brother. And that opens the door for some really powerful scenes once Ilya begins to isolate himself and starts to struggle more visibly with his mental health. Because unlike Shane, Svetlana has known Ilya since they were kids and understands the patterns in his behavior. So she knows how he withdraws and how he deflects and how he hides his pain behind humor and anger. And she doesn't know how that manifests within his relationship with Shane per se.
Unlike Svetlana, Shane does understand the depth of Ilya's emotional vulnerability within their relationship. So the idea of bringing their two perspectives together could create such a really compelling emotional bridge in season 2, especially during the time period where Ilya starts to push everyone away. I also think it would be deeply meaningful for Shane to have someone he can turn to who loves Ilya as much as he does, because up until this point, Shane has largely carried the emotional weight of trying to understand and protect Ilya on his own. So the show could create opportunities that allow him to share that with Svetlana, and I think that that would also be incredibly moving. There's so much potential there for conversations between them to be a vehicle to reveal more about Ilya's self-worth and his depression and the way he chooses to isolate himself when he's struggling and externalize a lot of what's happening in a deeply and largely internal storyline for Ilya that takes place in the long game.
All right, I'm going to end this Q&A episode there. I feel like those 3 questions went well with one another, and I loved the topics. Thank you again to everyone who submitted a question. I really love getting to talk to people in my DMs on Instagram and TikTok or wherever they're sending me these questions ahead of answering them formally on the podcast. So if you have any questions you want me to cover, please send them my way. It's one of my favorite things to do. And a lot of times people asking questions like these get my creative juices flowing again and have me thinking about these scenes in a different way than when I first was doing the breakdowns of them months and months ago. So please send all your questions my way. I love doing these. And thank you as always for listening. If you got this far, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me yap about this show that we all love so much. And I look forward to doing it again in an upcoming episode.